Welcome to the show. I'm Eddy Kara, and I cover film and Canadian politics the way a psychologist would. This is episode 203 of Real Talk with Eddy Kara, which is called Canada Got Played and Nolan Got Overhyped. I want to ask you something before we get into this episode. What do a Canadian bridge and a Christopher Nolan film have in common? On the surface, absolutely nothing. One is $6.4 billion of public infrastructure connecting Windsor to Detroit. The other is a $250 million adaptation of the oldest story in Western civilization, shot on the most expensive cameras ever built, reviewed to within an inch of its life by people who have never disagreed with Christopher Nolan in their careers. But here is the thread I keep pulling on. Both stories, the bridge and the film, are about the same psychological phenomenon. What happens when power goes completely unchecked? When people who are supposed to be held accountable to the public, to history, to the source material, simply aren't. In one case, this means that a Canadian Prime Minister misrepresented the terms of a deal he made under duress, while calling it a win. In the other, it means one of the most gifted filmmakers alive, making the same four mistakes across consecutive films, because nobody in his orbit is willing to say, "Hey, Chris, we can't hear the dialogue yet again." Different scales, different stakes, same psychology. One theme: what happens when accountability disappears in politics and in art? Only on this episode of Real Talk with Eddy Kara. The Gordie Howe International Bridge, named after the greatest hockey player who ever lived, which already tells you this was built with a certain amount of national pride baked into the concrete. Windsor, Ontario, to Detroit, Michigan. 6 lanes over the Detroit River. One of the most critical corridors in the world. Canada built it. Canada paid for every single cent of this construction. $6.4 billion. Michigan? Well, Michigan co-owns it. Michigan contributed exactly $0 to build it. And now, because of a phone call from a billionaire, a social media post from a president, and a deal that our Prime Minister apparently mischaracterized to the Canadian public, the U.S. is going to collect 50% of the net revenue of that bridge for the next, not just few years, 15 years, before Canada even pays itself back. So take a real breath, because every time I've found the bottom of this story, there's always another layer underneath it. Now let's go back to 2012. Canada and the state of Michigan signed the Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement, where Canada pays for everything. The bridge, ports of entry, both of them, the Michigan Inter-Exchange, every dollar, because the Michigan legislature at the time refused to contribute. In exchange, Canada gets to collect all the toll revenue until it recoups what it spent initially. Not just one side, on both directions of the toll revenue. All of it for approximately 50 years before profits start splitting with Michigan. Now, is that unfair to Michigan? No. They put absolutely nothing, and they still get a bridge. Is it unfair to Canada? Well, I would say no on this point alone, because Canada gets paid back first. And it's an equity deal, a genuine one. And here's where equity theory comes in. Psych lens. Adams developed the equity theory to explain how people evaluate fairness in any exchange relationship. The core principle? The ratio of your inputs to your outcomes should be proportional to the other party's ratio. So basically, if you put in more, you get back more, or get it back first in this case. The original 2012 deal was an equity theory model. So basically, Canada's input was $6.4 billion till today, 100% of the cost. Canada's outcome? First right of return in all of the revenue until it is repaid, 100%, not just 50. Then start sharing. That's not being greedy. That's actually mathematically fair and equitable. However, the New Deal breaks that ratio before Canada is even made whole. And it breaks it not because anyone decided a different ratio was more equitable than the other, but rather because of one man with a checkbook who decided to manufacture a crisis. Matthew Moroun owns the Ambassador Bridge, which is a privately operated crossing that has held a near monopoly on truck traffic across the Detroit River. His family has owned that for decades. It is quite extraordinarily profitable. The Gordie Howe Bridge changes that. The moment it opens, truckers have a choice and actual competition. In case anyone forgot, that is also catastrophic for a monopoly's bottom line, because there's an alternative. So the Moroun family spent years and millions to try to stop that bridge from being built, from lawsuits to lobbying to political interference. Every tool available to them, and none of them worked. And then Donald Trump gets elected. On January 16th, 2026, less than a month before Trump threatened to block the Gordie Howe Bridge from opening, Matthew Moroun donated $1 million to MAGA Inc., which is the pro-Trump super PAC. On February 9th, Moroun visited the White House and met with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Hours later, and not just days, hours later, Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social, quote, "I will not allow this bridge to open until the United States is fully compensated for everything we have given them. We should own perhaps at least one half of this asset. Everything we have given them." The United States gave Canada nothing towards the bridge, not a single dollar actually. So the entire factual premise of Donald Trump's complaint is literally false. But here's the thing about coercive power. You don't actually need facts on your side as a factual premise. You just need leverage. Psych lens, coercive power, and regulatory capture. French and Raven identified 6 types of social power in 1959. Most political power operates through legitimate authority or expert knowledge or even the ability to reward, and all require the other party to consent to it for it to work. Coercive power, however, is different. It operates through the threat of harm, blackmail, and so on, and it never requires the other party to consent to it. In this case, Canada had a legal right. Canada had a signed agreement. Canada had moral clarity. None of that, however, matters against coercive power when the other party is simply willing to ignore legitimacy entirely. And beneath the coercive power, it is operating simultaneously with the notion of regulatory capture. That's actually when government stops acting in the public interest and starts acting on behalf of a specific private interest. In this case, one billionaire, threatened by public infrastructure competition, used political donations and personal access to the president to bend the executive branch of the world's largest superpower. One check, one meeting, one social media post. 6 hours, $6.4 billion of Canadian leverage just gone. Prime Minister Mark Carney was genuinely in a terrible and quite an impossible position. The alternative for him would be leaving the bridge closed indefinitely, with billions in stranded investment and a critical trade corridor shut down. And that is not really an option. So yeah, some concession was probably inevitable and inescapable, I might add. Here's where BATNA comes in. Cyclen's BATNA, which stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. Basically, your BATNA is your walkaway exit option, your exit strategy. What do you do if no deal gets made? And your BATNA determines power at the table more than almost anything else, really. So if your BATNA is strong from the get-go, you negotiate from a position of strength. But if your BATNA is weak, you negotiate from a position of desperation. Now, even if you're wearing a good suit and framing everything as a positive, Canada's BATNA here was essentially problematic, and even one called it a catastrophe. A closed bridge, $6.4 billion in stranded investment. The Windsor-Detroit supply chain in freefall because of it. Now, Trump knew this. Moroun also knew this. Canada was not negotiating from a position of strength. Canada was simply managing a long-term surrender on this deal and trying to make it look like a handshake. Here's what Carney announced. For 15 years, Canada will split 50% on the net revenue with an economic development fund established and solely controlled by the United States government. And here's what Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre said in response.
Imagine you spent $1 million building a rental property, and then your neighbor said he wanted to collect half the rent. You paid 100% of the cost and you get only 50% of the revenue? What a terrible deal. Well, that's exactly the deal that Mark Carney just brought home on the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Canada paid for the entire $6.4 billion price tag. We even funded the infrastructure on the American side of the river, all with the understanding that we would collect 100% of the tolls until we recouped our money. Carney just agreed to give half the tolls to a Michigan economic development body that did not pay a dime to build the thing. This is our grandmaster negotiator? Look, I don't think we should fight with our American friends just for the sake of it. But here's what's clear. Carney's approach of elbows up when he thinks the president is not looking and sucking up to his face is not working. It has only given us double the tariffs on more goods and given us the only recession in the G7.
Now, Carney's public defense was, quote, "The word net does a lot of work in this. We are sharing after Canada is paid back, so we get the revenues. Then the servicing of the costs of the bridge and paying the debt of the bridge. And then what's left over, there's a split of that for 15 years. Now, here's the actual text of the deal, which was posted publicly just this week, which says all revenues collected with respect to the bridge, minus operating costs. Now, what do we mean by operating costs? The toll booth staffing, maintenance, snow removal, and what is also not mentioned is the debt repayment, not defined as an actual deduction, not part of the net calculation. However, a senior government official confirmed that debt servicing is actually not subtracted before the revenue split, and acknowledged that this could result in Canada taking longer, not shorter, to recoup its costs. Carney also said that the bridge opened on time and on budget. Actually, it opened on July 27th of this week alone. And another caveat, the original budget was $5.7 billion, and the final cost as of today is $6.4 billion. Matthew Moroun couldn't stop the bridge from being built. He couldn't win in court. He couldn't stop the permits. But he could actually write a check. And that check bought Canada renegotiating a signed international agreement under duress. And our Prime Minister described the result as a good deal. Trump is calling it literally in his own words, a, quote, much better deal for America. He's actually not wrong. That's the part that keeps me up at night. Here's where the notions of fairness also come in. Cyclen's distributive versus procedural justice. Research on organizational justice consistently finds that people who evaluate fairness on two dimensions, distributive justice, where we ask, was the outcome fair? And procedural justice, was the process fair? Now, Carney's defense is a distributive argument. So the actual dollar amounts are small. The early revenues will be minimal. And he may actually be right, but only mathematically in this case. But procedural justice is completely destroyed. The process was a billionaire, Moroun, donated $1 million to a super PAC, Mega Inc., met with a cabinet secretary, and hours later, a president threatened to strand $6.4 billion of Canadian infrastructure, unless Canada gave away revenue it was legally entitled to keep. Research consistently shows that people can accept bad outcomes when they trust the process and do not forgive bad outcomes produced by that process that they know was rigged from the get-go. This is why Canadians have been angry about this bridge, and it's been quite a controversy when the government kept saying that the financial impact is only small. The anger isn't about the math. It's actually about the process. The Gordie Howe Bridge officially opened on July 27th. Trucks will cross it, trade will flow. And by most economic measures, that's a good thing. But the story of how it opened does not end this week. That story is a case study in coercive power, in regulatory power, in what happens when legitimacy runs into leverage, and leverage wins. And in a country that just paid $6.4 billion of our taxpayer money for a bridge, it's now sharing the revenue from before it even gets to recoup it back. We deserve to say that out loud, clearly, without the spin. And that's exactly what we just did. All right, we've talked about a bridge that Canada paid for that America is now profiting from. I need a palate cleanser. You need a palate cleanser. Let's have a palate cleanser. Next up is my brand new segment called Eddy's Final Cut, where I give you my unfiltered, unapologetic, deeply psychological, and occasionally unhinged take on the Odyssey, Christopher Nolan's newest film after the break, reviewed by someone who has an actual framework for human behavior. Don't go anywhere. A brand new segment. Welcome to Eddy's Final Cut, where I get to say what I actually think. No hedging, no on the hand, and no, it's complicated. And today's final cut is Myth, Mud, and the most overhyped man in Hollywood, Christopher Nolan. The Odyssey, $250 million. The first feature film in history shot entirely on IMAX 70mm cameras. Stars Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, Tom Holland, Zendaya, Robert Pattinson, Charlize Theron, Lupita Nyong'o, and Elon Musk having a meltdown on the internet about the casting choices, which, by the way, was factually wrong on almost every specific claim. But we're going to get to that. 97% on Rotten Tomatoes, a $264 million opening weekend. Let's talk about it. Let's start with what Nolan, in my view, actually got right. And I went into this film genuinely wanting to love it. And in many moments I did. Matt Damon is great, even magnificent. I mean that without any qualification whatsoever. This might be one of his best performances in his career, though not his most famous. I personally preferred him in The Martian. And while many believe that he was miscast for this role, I had no major issues with it. He plays Odysseus, not as a legend, but a man. And later on, we get to see him as sort of an anti-hero. A man who did terrible things during a terrible war. Spent 10 years being punished for them. And isn't entirely sure he deserves to go home. He grew even a full beard for an entire year because Christopher Nolan refused the use of artificial beards. And somehow that one detail tells you everything about how seriously both of them took this role. Anne Hathaway plays his wife, the Queen of Ithaca Penelope. She's quietly devastating. Even though throughout the majority of the film, she's, in almost every scene you see her in, always weaving, and the weave is never finished, by the way. There's a scene where she's sitting in her loom, and the stillness of her body alone tells you more about the 20 years of waiting than any amount of dialogue ever could. Now, that's not just acting, that's communicating. And that is exactly why you cast someone like Anne Hathaway. Tom Holland plays Odysseus' son, Telemachus. He didn't really surprise me as much, but this is the first non-superhero role I've seen him in where he is fully and completely trying to play the character without having a mask on, no quips, and not much safety net. He plays a young man growing up in the shadow of a father, having a huge chip on his shoulder, who's simultaneously a legend and an absence. And then we have one of the most outstanding performers in the entire cast, Samantha Morton, who is amazing as Circe. And I actually think she's going to get a nomination for Best Supporting Actress. She was amazing as playing someone who has suffered at the hands of soldiers in the past and still struggling to overcome and forgive. Now, there's also John Leguizamo, who plays the loyal Emus. He's also someone else to watch out for this Oscar season that's coming up. A career-spanning richness in that performance. And if there's a supporting actor conversation this year, it shouldn't just be Samantha Morton for the female category. His name should be on top of it as well. Ludwig Göransson's score is extraordinary in this film. The Cyclops sequence is horror filmmaking at its finest. It puts you at a lot of unease, and it's a 60-foot practical puppet that they used with real shadows, basically making it genuinely unsettling in many ways that CGI simply cannot replicate. There's a psychological concept called authentic expressiveness. The idea that genuine emotion, even when raw and imperfect, connects with audiences in ways that polished performance simply cannot replicate. When this film is working, and it's basically when Matt Damon is carrying the weight of Odysseus' guilt, with Anne Hathaway communicating 20 years without so much as a word from Odysseus. Tom Holland navigating the impossible gravity of a father who is more than myth than man. It's because these performers are operating at a level of authentic expressiveness that no amount of IMAX grandeur could manufacture. The technology serves the performance. That is Nolan at his absolute best. And that's where the defense ends. Because we need to talk about what also doesn't work. And there's quite a few. And it's also significantly more of it than a 97% score would imply. Problem 1, the pacing of the film and the first act itself. So it's a very long movie, 2 hours and 52 minutes long. And it feels the first act being very fast-paced, which is very typical in a Chris Nolan film. It's more like a montage pretending to be a movie. We're never really introduced to these characters properly. We're simply being told about them. from other characters. And that's one thing you do notice in the first act, especially the film, which was a major issue for me. Because the first 20 to 30 minutes of the film was cut really fast at such relentless efficiency that by the time the film slows down, let's say half of the film, you don't know anyone well enough, or you don't genuinely connect to any of the characters. You've been just fed information. You haven't been given actual people you could relate to. And then by the half of the first half of the movie's finishing, and then the second half begins, the pacing is so slow that you just wish you press the fast forward button at a lot of times, actually. And you do feel that it's a long movie. And in a story about 20 years of longing, loss, and loyalty, that's quite a costly mistake to make. And not just in the first half hour, but with the remainder of the film. Research on parasocial relationships, the psychological bonds audiences form with fictional characters, shows that emotional investment requires time. You need to observe a character making choices, showing vulnerability, revealing something true about who they are or who they were before the plot demands something of them. Yet in this case, Nolan's montage structure denies us of that time. And then the film asks us to feel enormous things with a lot of weight for people we just met minutes ago. It's kind of like when you're asked to cry at a stranger's funeral. The grief might be real to you, but you haven't earned the grief yet. And that's oftentimes what the major issue was. Problem 2, the dialogue. Let me just start by saying the dialogue is very clunky. And Chris Nolan has answered numerous times that he's aware of it and just doesn't care. He has said publicly that he does not prioritize dialogue. He believes that cinema is visual and that audiences should absorb story through context and body language. He's actually even described his mixing choices as radical and expressed surprise at how conservative audiences are about wanting to hear what characters say. I mean, he's not wrong that cinema's a visual medium. However, he is wrong that this excuses giving Lupita Nyong'o and Charlize Theron lines that don't really match their talent at all. You cannot simultaneously cast the most magnetic actors alive and write them dialogue that a Wikipedia article would definitely improve. Also, the choice of the American accent. While most films always have their actors using the British accent, primary example was Troy, Brad Pitt, trying to have a British accent, of course. And there's also this one scene where there's this one man who speaks in Greek, and then one of the characters is translating, and then Matt Damon's Odysseus and the other characters speak to him in English. So that's another issue with the dialogue. And then the dialogue is not supposed to be as modern, but I could have given him quite a pass if the dialogue was not too modern, to the point where you're using the F-bomb quite consistently. And also the choice of words such as, instead of father, daddy, which Robert Pattinson uses at least twice, which did bother me quite a lot. Problem number 3, the sound mixing. The sound mixing is usually quite a catastrophe in a Chris Nolan film. You have Nolan, I call it the Nolan disease, that has fully metastasized throughout his films, and multiple people who reviewed the film called the Odyssey sound grudge band muddy and loud, which is a phrase I love so much, and I actually want to put it on a t-shirt and wear it to the Oscars. Several critics noted that at home, closed captions would have been mandatory. And the siren sequence, one of the most anticipated moments of the entire film in my view, which Nolan deliberately muted the audio completely. So we're just watching Odysseus screaming, being tied to the mast of the ship, and you cannot hear a single thing, and you cannot even hear what he's screaming towards. The Zeigarnik effect is the principle that incomplete or interrupted experiences are remembered more vividly than actual ones. Nolan clearly understands this. He's built his entire career around it. Leave things unresolved, primarily in Inception, its ending, and the audience leans forward. But there's a limit. When the incompleteness is the sound itself, when you literally cannot hear any of the dialogue whatsoever, the Zeigarnik effect stops creating productive tension and actually starts creating frustration and confusion. Your brain isn't leaning forward anymore or doesn't want to hear more. It's just tired of asking, wait, what did he just say? That's not radical filmmaking. That's actually become a hearing test with a $250 million budget. Problem number 4, the visual palette. The choice of color grading, it's quite dark, muddy, and monochromatic, which is quite infamous in a Nolan film. But in this film in particular, it is on IMAX, on a $250 million budget. They've shot across Greece, Italy, and Morocco. And this is now the 4th consecutive film that Nolan always got the same criticism for. For instance, in Dunkirk, it was too dark and monochromatic. Tenet, flat and monochromatic. Oppenheimer, stagey and monochromatic. The Odyssey, way too dark and monochromatic. He built the most powerful cinema cameras in film history. He shot across 6 continents. The IMAX 70mm format captures color with a depth that makes digital look like a photocopy. And yet, he used it to make everything look like a very expensive rainstorm at night, or even at dusk. At some point, dark and gritty stops being a tone and actually starts being a habit. And habits, unlike choices, don't serve the story. They just show up whether you invited them or not. Problem number 5. This film has absolutely no comic relief, and Homer absolutely did. Now, Homer's Odyssey is not a 3,000-year-old meditation on war, played entirely in shadow. It is also, alongside everything else, genuinely funny. Odysseus, actually, is a trickster. The gods squabble like a dysfunctional family, sort of at Thanksgiving dinner. There's the absurdity of men who cannot stop themselves eating the sun god's cattle after being told a lot of times, repeatedly, explicitly by a goddess, do not eat the sun god's cattle. And they end up eating the cattle anyways. Not just once, every single time. Now, fast forward to Nolan's version. Nolan strips all of that out. The film is ponderously serious from frame 1. Not a single moment of genuine levity. Now, I'm not saying that it should have been like the Marvel movies or the DC Comics movies. We're not going that far. But at least having some different moments of comic relief so that you actually feel those parts of seriousness being mixed with levity. Research on emotional processing shows that contrast is what gives tragedy its weight. When everything is equally grave, nothing registers as grave. The brain needs relief, a break, to recognize intensity. Laughter before loss makes the loss land a lot harder, not softer. And that's not a screenwriting opinion. It's how human emotional processing actually works. Homer knew this 3,000 years ago. He actually put jokes in his epic because jokes make the grief heavier, not lighter. Nolan, with all of his genius and successes, apparently did not get the memo. Or he probably got the memo and filed it under conservative audience expectations I don't share, which, given the sound mixing, kind of tracks. Problem 6. The women are underwritten in a film where Homer gives them everything. Here's the irony. Nolan actually spent 6 months being accused of disrespecting the ancient source material because of who he cast. And let's remember, this is when Elon Musk personally weighed in, and that's when the culture war machine ran at full capacity. Okay? And at this time, I was thinking to myself, well, who's handling the PR of this film? Because, Elon Musk was quite aggressive, and was there nobody who could actually refute the things that were being thrown at them? That's why you would have a PR spokesperson, per se, a specialist, an expert in public relations. But Nolan and his production team decided to stay completely quiet. And what occurs when there's total silence and there's not an effort to actually address these circulating rumors? Well, it affects the perception and willingness of most people to go see the film because of so much negative press. So addressing it early on would have been ideal, especially with regards to Elliot Page's character. And then fast forward to 6 months later, the film comes out. Nyong'o plays as twin sisters, Helen of Troy and then Clytemnestra. Both are blink and miss them appearances. Okay. Charlize Theron also plays Calypso, which was fine, but she was very much a supporting character without much dialogue apart from helping Matt Damon's Odysseus remember. Samantha Morton Circe, one of the most powerful and complex figures in all of Greek mythology, gets only a handful of scenes that don't give Morton nearly enough to work with. The people who screamed about the casting for 6 months were quite obviously wrong about their specific complaints. And they accidentally identified a real problem and just gave it the wrong name. So let's remember that there was a huge controversy about Elliot Page being cast as Achilles. But if you watched just the movie Troy in 2004, you would know that Brad Pitt's Achilles actually dies. Same thing in the Greek mythology. There's no Achilles, in the Odyssey because he's already killed by Paris of Troy, no less. So this idea that Elliot Page is playing Achilles was very much wrong-founded. In fact, Elliot Page only appears in 2 scenes, and he's actually playing a soldier who's actually delivering the Trojan horse. Problem number 7. No one in this film actually talks to each other, and you notice that quite a lot. One of the biggest pet peeves that I've had was the character Agamemnon also. You barely see him say anything, and in the one scene in Hell where he basically says something, you finally hear his voice, but you still don't see his face. Throughout the entire film, in scenes where he does appear, he's just appearing. The Odyssey is a story about a man and his crew going on this Odyssey, loyalty being tested to destruction. We never feel that bond because we never see it build. And Homer has kept you attached to those sailors for 3,000 years, whereas Nolan loses them just in the opening montage. Problem 8. Sinon, played by Elliot Page, is not in Homer at all. I saved this for last because it's almost poetic. Sinon was never a character in the Odyssey. He is not in the Iliad. He's actually in Virgil's Aeneid, which is a Latin epic written approximately 500 years after Homer's Iliad. Different author, different civilization, different language, by the way. So Nolan, who spent months being accused of disrespecting Homer's source material, imported a character from an entirely different ancient author without even acknowledging and giving credit to that author, while actually sidelining all these female characters. And the worst is basically having Zendaya playing as the representation or the manifestation into a human form, only appearing in some scenes. And then you barely hear her say anything throughout the entire film. And now let's talk about the Oscar question and my actual position. I don't think the Odyssey wins Best Picture at the 2027 Academy Awards. And here's why. The recency effect tells us what the most recently experienced items in a sequence are weighted most heavily in memory and judgment. Sort of think to yourselves as someone's lasting impression. The availability heuristic tells us that we overestimate the likelihood of things we can easily bring to mind. The week after a $264 million opening, The Odyssey is the most available, most recent, most vivid film in everyone's minds. And yeah, majority people think it's a masterpiece, so it should be a frontrunner for Best Picture. It's actually the film that people are still talking about. And in fact, people are putting a lot of bets on that. But by February 2027, after 8 months of festival darlings, late-year prestige releases, and whatever Denis Villeneuve does with Dune Part 3, the Academy will be evaluating The Odyssey from a much different psychological distance. And at that distance, structural problems loom larger than they do in the glow of the opening weekend. The Academy has a documented, complicated history for Nolan. For years, they acknowledged his technical brilliance while keeping him from the top prizes. Oppenheimer finally broke that seal. But the question is now whether they return to the same well 3 years later. The last two directors to win Best Picture twice in the same decade were Clint Eastwood, 12 years apart, and Milos Forman, 9 years apart. Nolan would be doing it in 3. And Dune Part 3 is coming. And let's not forget about my personal frontrunner, Hail Mary Project. So here's my final verdict. I would give this 3 stars on 5. And that's my rating for this film. It's a pretty good achievement with real, honest limitations. It's a film that reaches for the gods and grazes them. Matt Damon, Samantha Morton, and John Leguizamo give probably the best performances of their careers. Anne Hathaway doing more with stillness than most actors can do with monologues. A score that should win every award it's eligible for. And a Cyclops scene that will genuinely make you uncomfortable in the best way. But also a first act that doesn't let you in, with dialogue that doesn't always serve its cast, sound that requires active effort to hear and decode, colors that forgot that the Mediterranean is blue, women that Homer gave everything to, and Nolan gave almost nothing. It's magnificent, yet frustrating. It's absolutely worth, though, seeing on the biggest IMAX screen you could find. And though it will not win Best Picture, go see it anyways. And then you can come argue with me for. I'm Eddy Kara, and this has been episode 203 of Real Talk with Eddy Kara.